Chinese President Xi Jinping and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron have issued a joint statement reaffirming their strong support for the Paris Climate Accord. In Beijing, President Macron said cooperation between Europe and China on reducing emissions could be decisive. It follows the Trump administration's move to start the formal process of withdrawing the US from the 2015 accord. Both Xi and Macron have said the accord is irreversible.
Over the past 2 years, in the fight against climate change, we have consistently acted together with great effectiveness and commitment. I regret the choices made by a few other countries, but I want to see them as marginal choices. When China, the European Union, and Russia ratify the Paris Agreement and make a firm commitment, the isolated choice made by one or another country won't change the course of the world.
And for more with me, I have in the studio Tim Schaunberg. He's from DW's Environment Desk. Welcome, Tim. Now, we heard both the presidents from France and China talk about the Paris Climate Accord being irreversible. What does this really mean?
Well, let me explain a bit. China is the largest emitter of CO2 emissions worldwide, relying on coal as their prime energy source. At the same time, China just agreed to reduce from 2030 on, from then on, not emitting more CO2. So furthermore, China has just a status as a developing country within the Paris Agreement. This means that their commitments are even less binding than the commitments of industrial countries. So this agreement, this statement has to be put in a context of the EU trying to bind China more into the Paris Agreement for speeding up their targets. So Emmanuel Macron is on an EU mission regarding climate change in this context here. So EU is kind of trying to take the lead in climate policies.
So let's take a listen to what the Chinese President Xi Jinping had to say.
In
the face of some of the most major changes ever seen over the last century, China and France, as permanent members of the Security Council and representatives of Eastern and Western civilizations, must assume more responsibilities as two powerful nations.
So we heard Xi Jinping talking there, Tim, and he's talking about China taking more responsibility. But in actually per capita terms, China is not the biggest polluter. It is Australia, and US is one of the biggest polluters. Given that, how much of a gap will US's pulling out of the climate accord have?
Well, definitely the withdrawal of the United States out of the Paris Agreement is a big political loss, definitely. Just to give one example, back then when the agreement was signed, China and India just agreed in large parts to make commitments because the United States were also taking action. So now there is definitely a loss, a gap, sorry. But as we see this agreement being announced as irreversible, we see that there are attempts and there is an effort to keep this agreement alive. And coming to a question, if the EU and China are able to fill up the gap, well, this is an agreement on the paper so far. There will no measurements follow so far. And also China, with the status as a developing country within the Paris Agreement, will not have to pay for the Global Climate Fund, which the US did. So they will not close this financial gap, for example.
Now, at another level, you have some 11,000 scientists coming up with proposals and talking about the urgency of taking action to avert climate disaster. There seems to be a broader momentum growing in society on dealing with this issue.
Well, definitely. We have seen protests the last months, Friday for Future, many civil society groups, green parties are strong on the polls, at least in Europe. So also the Commissioner's President-elect Ursula von der Leyen announced in her first speech, we want to push the green topics, the climate topics further in the next years. So it is definitely a momentum, but okay, what is coming out, we have to see that. In December, we will have another climate conference in Madrid, and if there will further steps being taken, if there are more agreements, we have to wait for that. But we also have to be clear about one thing. This trip from Macron and the meeting with Xi Jinping, okay, they had this agreement making the Paris Agreement irreversible, or calling it irreversible, but at the same time, they also contracted trade deals for about $15 billion. So it was also about that.
Right. We have to keep it in perspective. As you said, Tim Schaunberg from DW's Environment Desk, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.